Hello, it's Kamal here. Today, a team of Russian agents have been found guilty following the biggest spying investigation in Britain. The spy ring, made up of Bulgarians, plotted kidnaps, disinformation campaigns, surveillance against Ukrainian troops, and secret weapon trades with China from their base in Great Yarmouth. The group received orders from Moscow via Jan Marsalek, a fugitive tech boss and one of the most wanted men in Europe. Today, for Daily Tea listeners, a special set of episodes. This weekend, we are handing over the Daily Tea podcast to Telegraph's Special Correspondent Hayley Dixon, who has been on the trail of Marsalek for over a year and has made 3 special investigative episodes. You're about to hear episode 1, and episodes 2 and 3 will be published on Saturday and Sunday.
It's an unassuming guest house in the seaside town of Great Yarmouth, but it's no holiday home. There are boxes piled up in every room, with tech equipment and bags full of cables. There are metal storage shelves across the walls. For almost 3 years, behind its mundane facade, a group of Bulgarians have been running a spy ring for Russia. And in February 2023, after an investigation, the police finally cracks down.
5 Bulgarian nationals appeared in court today suspected of spying for Russia.
They were charged with conspiracy to conduct espionage.
Prosecutions for espionage in British courts are extremely rare. Usually, spies get put on a plane and expelled from the country. This case, however, is different. These aren't Russians spying for the motherland. They are EU citizens, carrying out the orders of the Russian state on British soil. And because they were plotting in the UK, they will be prosecuted here.
The defendants, all Bulgarian nationals, were held in February and have been remanded in custody since. Now, it is alleged they were working for the Russian security services.
The story made front-page news, and in September 2023, the case opened at Westminster Magistrates. The press gathered in a hushed courtroom to hear the charges. The Bulgarians joined via video link from their prisons, standing and speaking only to confirm their names and dates of birth. As they sat down, the prosecutor began outlining the case against them. Journalists furiously scribbling shorthand to try and get down every word. These charges were classed as terrorism offences, she said. She described how the allegations of kidnapping and surveillance were so serious they would have to be referred to one of Britain's most senior judges. And then she dropped a bombshell. The tasker from Moscow was a man whose name was known by many in the courtroom, Jan Marsalek. But he wasn't known as a spy. He had been the boss at one of Germany's most successful tech firms, and he'd allegedly been behind one of the country's biggest financial scandals. In 2020, he went on the run, and until that day in Westminster, he had not been heard from for 3 years. Interpol had been searching for him. The press across Europe had been searching for him. No one knew if he was even alive. Until that day, when it became clear that he had been giving orders on behalf of the Kremlin. That trial that brought Marsalek back into the limelight has concluded this week after a 2-year-long court battle. So I've been trying to understand Jan Marsalek's unusual life. A whiz kid from a tiny Austrian town, who first was allegedly Germany's biggest white-collar criminal, and who ended up as a Russian operative, plotting surveillance, kidnappings and disinformation campaigns in the UK and across the world.
Because it had everything that you need for a gangster movie or gangster thriller. It has intelligence services, organized crime, money laundering and digital finance.
So who is Jan Marsalek? How did he use his wealth and connections to join the world of intelligence?
It seems like a Shakespearean tragedy. It really does.
I'm Hayley Dixon, Special Correspondent at The Telegraph, and I've been tracing Jan Marsalek from the boardroom to the courtroom. And this is the Daily Tea Investigates, the tech boss who was Russia's secret spy. Episode 1. All roads lead to Moscow. Jan Marsalek's story starts in Aschheim, near Munich, in 2000. He's 20. He's a school dropout with no qualifications, but he's a computer genius. Slim and clean-shaven, with short-cropped hair and a pair of thin glasses that suit the persona of an IT nerd, he's just been hired by an up-and-coming tech company called Wirecard. Wirecard was one of the first platforms that processed online payments. It was hailed as Germany's answer to PayPal.
These days you can buy everything from everywhere at any time. New technologies are emerging at a fast pace and change the way we search, select, and buy.
I loved Wirecard. I loved working there. It was a wonderful place to work.
This is Martin Osterloh. He joined Wirecard in the early days, when it was everything you'd expect from a young company hiring computer whiz kids. Staff would turn up to the office dressed in their T-shirts and jeans. You wouldn't get that at the Daily Telegraph.
Everyone knew each other. We had a cafeteria where basically you knew from employee 1 to 120, like a family of employees.
It also had some of the rougher elements of a startup company.
It did have a hire and fire culture. It was a we make money or leave type of culture right from the onset.
Marsalek's computer skills became invaluable to the fledgling company.
So when you met him, the first impression was extremely good because he was such a charming guy. In fact, over the years, and I don't want to sound like I'm idolizing him too much, but I really envied him for the way that he was able to charm people. He did have a certain aura about him, a certain energy, which was extremely addictive, a natural charisma in a form where I've seldomly ever experienced that with other people.
Like a lot of tech startups, Wirecard had a stratospheric rise. It was undoubtedly of importance to the German economy. In 2018, it had done the unthinkable. On paper, it was bigger than Deutsche Bank, with its shares supposedly worth 24 billion euros. At one point, the country's then Chancellor, Angela Merkel, had even lobbied for the company during an official trip to China.
It was an incredible experience. The witnessing a rise that was unprecedented and a fall that probably was unprecedented in Germany of such a big company was a hell of an experience. It was almost like a movie.
Marsalek seemed tailor-made for the world of high finance. Confident, quick-witted, and always one step ahead. Qualities that propelled him to the heart of Wirecard's success. Soon, he'd become the company's chief operating officer. He led a lavish lifestyle, rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous, having dinner with former presidents, and all the while boasting about his new life. After work, he'd jump into the back of one of his sports cars and go out on the town.
There were a couple of very posh places where celebrities also went, and they would, have bills in the thousands of euros.
In a video posted by the German newspaper Handelsblatt, Marsalek can be seen trying to pop a bottle of expensive champagne on one of his decadent evenings.
Well, if I find a weak spot, but I'm... What's this? Here it is.
Can you chill it properly?
It's one tap.
Can you chill it properly?
Marsalek went all out. Everything you'd expect from a 20-something who got access to a lot of money all at once. But fine wine and expensive meals were not necessarily enough.
He would invest money or invest his connections to actually experience shooting a gun or a rocket launcher or something like that, experiencing the extreme. That was on the one side. On the other hand, he didn't have a driver's license. So there were certain contradictions even in that. He was flying around in private jets but didn't have a driver's license.
But behind Wirecard's meteoric success, there turned out to be a whole lot of lies. The payments the platform processed often came from gambling and pornography, a world full of money laundering and illegal transactions. Early on, the company was accused of balance sheet fraud, the first in a string of allegations that were made repeatedly throughout its rise. Then, in June 2020, the tech giant completely unravelled, and so did Marsalek's persona. Just a week before the company collapsed, Martin saw a very different side to Marsalek.
We had a video conference about a company that we potentially wanted to acquire. And he sent us a presentation he was going to hold in front of the other board members. And he had put some elements in there that were just not correct. We told him basically, you need to change this. And an hour later, he hadn't changed a thing. So he blatantly lied to the rest of the board. And the three of us were awestruck. But it just was not possible to contradict him. That would have been our jobs. If we had sort of said, no, we told him not to put this in, we'd have been out of a job within seconds. So we played along, but each one of us looked at each other like, what do we do? That was quite an experience. Now, people tell untruths or they exaggerate, but an explicit lie after we told him not to, that was one of the moments where it sort of dawned on me, there's something going on here. This guy was always about big and bigger. Maybe that was his downfall, that he wanted Wirecard to be explosively big, and he found every means to do it.
When Wirecard collapsed in 2020 with a 1.9 billion euro hole in its books, it was the largest company ever to go bust in Germany. Marsalek and the rest of Wirecard's executive team are sacked. Wirecard's offices and his apartment are raided by the police. The executive team is arrested. Wirecard's CEO is put in custody, accused of fraud, market manipulation and money laundering. So are the chief financial officer and the former head of accounting. They are currently on trial in Germany. But while officers are preparing to arrest him, Marsalek is in the back of a taxi, speeding on the motorway and leaving Vienna behind him. He's dressed in Prada from head to toe when he steps out on the tarmac of Bad Voslau airfield. It's a small airport located in Lower Austria with a few hangars that hold private jets, a tower and a single restaurant.
The day he was fired, I wrote him an SMS where I basically told him, it's been an honor. We had a very humorous back and forth. And he told me he was going into the sun for a while. He was going to a place like the Philippines looking for the money, which in the subsequent days you heard more and more rumors about the fact that perhaps he was running from the police. The pieces fell together and you heard more and more about money being embezzled and things like that.
But Marsalek didn't fly to the Philippines. He didn't look for the missing money. Instead, in the early hours of the evening, he boarded a private jet to Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Bad Voslau airfield has just become the scene of a getaway by a man who would go on to be one of Europe's most wanted criminals. A businessman who, unbeknownst to all, has just defected to Russia. Marsalek would go missing for 3 years before his name reappeared in the Westminster courtroom, which is where my investigation started. How did he use Wirecard to build ties with intelligence? Was he a Russian spy during his time at Wirecard? More on this after the break. It's not entirely a surprise that Jan Marsalek got embroiled in the intelligence world, and it didn't all start with the seedy world swarming behind Wirecard. Marsalek's fascination for intelligence seems to have deeply personal ties.
Jan Marsalek's grandfather also was a spy to some degree, and that's very interesting because he was also suspected of passing on information to the Soviets during the occupation of Austria.
Thomas Riegler is a historian in intelligence matters, hence his interest in the Marsalek case.
I wonder if this it could be the key to unlock actually the secret of Jan Marsalek.
Jan Marsalek was born in 1980, 10 years before the fall of the USSR. He grew up in the town of Klosterneuburg in Austria, and his father left when he was just a child.
This connection between grandfather and grandson is often quite intense, so there must have been some kind of influence, of course, coming from this person, especially when he has such a rich experience of history.
In modern Austria, Jan's grandfather, Hans Marsalek, has become a well-known figure of the post-war era.
His grandfather was not only a Nazi resistance fighter, but he also contributed to the establishment of the Austrian state police, which is also heavily involved in intelligence matters.
Oh, wow. Growing up, he might have had a bit of a knowledge of spying then, if that's what his grandfather was doing.
It must have left a big impression on him, because you have to remember that Hans Marsalek is now remembered as one of the leading figures in creating public memory about the Nazi past. He's greatly renowned in Austria. His past as an intelligence agent is not very much in the public knowledge, but it also must have contributed, of course, to Marsalek's fascination about the world of intelligence. When your grandfather, for example, tells you about how he hunted Nazi war criminals, this must have left some kind of impression.
I visited his hometown, just outside Vienna, to see if we could find out more about the real Jan Marsalek from his mother and brother. We knocked on their door to see if they were willing to speak to us. So we found the house. It's quite an old house, and it had sort of typical Viennese painted windows, a large wooden door with an old style bell that you actually rang the bell rather than pressed a buzzer. And it was on quite a quiet street in Keeling with a river one side and then narrow space for cars and then the houses on the other side. So we rang the bell, and it took a little while. I didn't think that anybody was going to be able to hear us, actually, because it was such an old-style bell. But eventually the brother opened one of the windows and poked his head out, and I confirmed that it was the right person and told him who I was. But as soon as I said that I was in the press, he shut the window on me and wouldn't talk to me. It turns out that, like many of the people I've tried to interview for this podcast, Marsalek's close family don't want to engage with journalists, which is not that surprising. Marsalek left home at 19 when he moved to Munich to get his foot in the door of the tech world. And in doing so, he shut the door on his family, who say that they haven't had much contact with him since. But I had heard a rumour that Marsalek was still in touch with his dad, despite him leaving when he was only a child. So I tried to track him down too. Could he tell me anything to understand his son's character better? Like so many involved in this case, Sasha Marsalek was a particularly difficult man to get hold of. Searches for addresses and contact details have involved trawling through company registers in every language from German to Hebrew, looking through Austrian secret investigation files, scouring through electoral rolls, and asking for help from various sources. It was through company registers in the Czech Republic that I traced Sasha to a flat in Prague. When I rang the bell, no one answered. After repeating this a few times, I realised that every time I rang that bell, a person came out onto the balcony that was hanging over the door. He wouldn't even answer the door to me, and I ended up having to shout up to him on his balcony. Hey, are you looking for Sasha Marsalek? Sasha Marsalek? Sorry, do you speak any English?
Yes, I understand a little bit.
A little bit. Are you Sasha Marsalek? Yes, my name's Hayley. I'm from the Daily Telegraph in London. I wanted to talk to you about your son, Jan.
And what about you will talk with me?
I just wanted to talk to you about whether you've spoken to him in a while, or if you know anything about his whereabouts, whether you're still in touch with him.
No, thank you very much.
No?
Sorry, but
no. No? Okay, thank you.
You did say that it was going to be quite difficult to get people on the record in regards to this story. Did you expect the reaction that we got when we were door knocking?
This is my producer, Georgia. Not really. I do a lot of door knocks in my job investigating, and you obviously do get a mixed reaction from people on different stories. But I think with this story particularly, it's been quite difficult because, I mean, Jan Marsalek, a lot of people have said that the attention that he's brought them in their lives has actually ruined their lives, really. After Marsalek's escape to Belarus, all these extraordinary stories emerged. It turned out that Marsalek was not just a businessman or an alleged fraudster, but in reality, he had been working as a Russian spy for over a decade. And it all started thanks to Wirecard. Back to his colleague, Martin Osterloh.
It doesn't surprise me completely that he had connections to security, undercover, etc. Of course, it surprised me completely that he's supposed to be, connected to the FSB or KGB. I would have never thought of that.
Wirecard was one of the early payments processing services. In the early noughties, the World Wide Web was still an unexplored continent, full of possibilities, for money, for power. It was a world swarming with seedy characters. Behind the company's sleek facade, its foundations were a lot murkier.
Like when there's a gold rush, There are also some fraudulent people there. I was curious just about how this new world of digital finance works, and it was what prompted my interest in it.
Fabio De Masi is a member of the European Parliament. At the time of Wirecard's collapse in 2020, he had been sitting as an MP for the Left Party in Germany's Bundestag. Wirecard and Marsalek have become somewhat of a passion project for him.
I was probably the first German politician who raised critical questions about Wirecard before they went bust, and later I was part of the inquiry committee on the Wirecard scandal in the German parliament.
It was 2017 when he first started looking into the company. Marsalek had been working there for 17 years and was a member of the executive team.
I had dealt with issues of money laundering, so the journalist approached me, and after the financial crisis there was this big talk about fintechs being the new game in town, companies that actually do business with data, and they use the internet and the data economy to facilitate financial transactions. And Wirecard was there was this amazing hype in Germany around now. We also the good old Germany now has a kind of 21st century company, Wirecard. And so I was a bit skeptical from the beginning. Apparently there was an interest from, let's say, the security environment on the kind of data they possessed, because they had a lot of customers from terrorist finance, organized crime, and so on.
Wirecard is really a prime target for intelligence because it provides kind of a window into the shadow economy.
Historian Thomas Riegler again.
Because you have to remember that all those transaction data is extremely valuable to any kind of intelligence service.
Fabio De Masi tells me that there was no doubt that Marsalek had access to information that would have been of use to the security services.
At some stage, I remember that Marsalek claimed that he needed a whole data set of his customers, of the Wirecard customers, to deliver it to the German intelligence service.
That's right. And I think the German intelligence services have claimed that they never asked for that. Is that right?
Exactly. They claimed that they never asked for that, and I cannot prove that they are wrong on that, but I have my doubts that they're saying the truth.
Yeah. And so originally this started as for many people, I think you said since 2017 you had suspicions about it being connected to espionage. But what for many people in 2020 thought was just a financial scandal, actually it turns out it's got quite a lot of links to espionage. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. There are all the allegations that Jan Marsalek would cooperate with Russian intelligence, but there were also a lot of contact points to Austrian intelligence members or former intelligence members. Very often it's former intelligence members. That seems to be a pattern, because then maybe, some services can say we don't have anything officially to do with it, but it is really a little bit too much to be a coincidence.
And what Fabio suggests is that cooperating with the police probably helped Wirecard and Marsalek get away with some of the company's wrongdoing.
This might have been an entry point, that's my hypothesis, where they said, okay, maybe if we cooperate, we continue our business model, but we cooperate sometimes with the agencies, that allows us to kick the can down the road.
Wirecard was so big that it seemed untouchable. Marsalek is said to have told a colleague, "We have so much money that we can do anything. We are so important to the German government that with every major disaster that occurs, the next day it appears as if it never happened." What's surprising is just how much Marsalek was involved with security agencies across the world. As soon as you start to scratch the surface, you realise that this guy had his fingers in every pie imaginable, and he made no secret of it.
If you try to tell that story to the public, which we did in the inquiry committee, sometimes people would look at you, they would think that you're a little bit cuckoo. It sounds like a thriller or a conspiracy theory, but actually all these things I'm telling you right now are just well-documented facts.
Investigations into the wrongdoing at Wirecard found that Marsalek had appointed himself as the head of enemy reconnaissance. Now, that isn't the language of the boardroom. That's quite dark, the language of espionage and warfare. Through Wirecard, he had hired private investigators, including former spies, to carry out surveillance on the company's critics and those who were questioning their practices. Some of the critics were victims of cyber attacks, and one was even punched in the head outside her New York apartment. Marsalek made no secret of his links to the intelligence community.
And then after Wirecard broke down, all these stories came out. And so he actually walked around with a tattoo on his forehead. I mean, that's a metaphor. He didn't really have a tattoo on his forehead, but with a tattoo on his forehead, just talk to me, I'm connected in the intelligence community.
He boasted to his inner circle that Wirecard produced credit cards for secret services across the world, and that he had worked for the British, the US, Mossad in Israel, and the BND, Germany's foreign intelligence agency. At the time, it wasn't clear what was true and what was just bravado. But evidence has since emerged that Wirecard was being used by the German intelligence agencies and the secret police. One source told me that Marsalek did have a very good connection with a representative of MI6 in London. Over his years at Wirecard, there are more disturbing stories. No one's really pieced all of these stories together, but I have. They all point to Marsalek's growing ties to Russia. They link Marsalek to assassination attempts and war crimes. One of them takes us right back to the UK.
Just behind me, about 100 feet over there, beneath that tent, is actually the bench where this former spy and his daughter were found. Now, 48 hours later, the police cordon's still here, and it's now an investigation that's drawn comment from the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
In March 2018, in the quiet, peaceful town of Salisbury, Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer who had been a double agent for Britain, was poisoned alongside his daughter, 33-year-old Yulia. Both were found unconscious on a park bench in the late afternoon outside a ZZ Italian restaurant. I was actually one of the reporters on the scene, and witnesses told me how initially they thought that they were drunk. But as they were rushed to hospital, the truth emerged, and the town centre was turned into a scene of chemical warfare. The cordon was absolutely huge, and police officers in hazmat suits were carefully picking over the evidence. Russian agents had smeared a nerve agent on the handle of Mr. Skripal's front door, poisoning father and daughter and a police officer, DS Nick Bailey, who had gone to investigate.
Vladimir Putin is on record as saying that there's a difference between enemies and traitors. Enemies you fight with, but you hope someday you can reach some kind of agreement.
Mark Galeotti is an expert in Russian security and intelligence.
Traitors, on the other hand, you can do nothing but kill them.
The Skripals were poisoned using a nerve agent called Novichok,
which is this nerve agent that is very distinctive for Russia. And it was really about the theatre of assassination. There are easier, simpler, lower-tech ways of killing someone. But they wanted to do it in a way that was going to be high profile, splashy, and would allow them to, on the one hand, say it was nothing to do with us, but with a kind of a sly wink that says, but it really was us.
Just a few months later, in the autumn, Marsalek shows up in London with a copy of a highly classified report on the incident, written by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is an intergovernmental organisation. He shows it to traders and even handed a copy to Paul Murphy, the head of investigations at the Financial Times. Authorities believe Marsalek got hold of the documents through his links to Austrian intelligence. So here's Jan Marsalek. He's a big tech businessman, and he's got a copy of a top-secret formula used in Russian assassinations.
And therefore, to actually have Novichok details in your possession, well, it shows one of two things. One is maybe you actually might want to be in a position to create and use it. Or secondly, it just shows a certain amount of kind of fanboyishness of the more cynical and heavy-handed forms of Russian intelligence activity.
By November 2018, the news had reached Bernhard Schmidbauer, a former German minister who, in the 90s, earned himself the nickname 008, as the coordinator of the German intelligence services.
So, Hayley, you went to find 008, didn't you?
That's producer Georgia again. I did. I actually climbed a mountain to try and find 008. It was a bit of a nightmare because I'd got to Germany and then I got a tip off from this source of mine that he'd actually moved to Austria, just over the border from where I was. But stupidly, I'd only booked a hire car to drive in Germany, not in Austria. And so I didn't want to waste any time, so I decided that rather than try and change anything, I'd just park at the border and walk to his house, But when I made that decision, I hadn't really thought about the fact that I was in the Alps.
I hope your risk assessment included trekking through mountains.
Well, actually, when I got there, I was pretty out of breath, to be honest with you. His wife answered the door and told me that I should have called, which obviously is a really good idea if only I'd have had his phone number. And I would have done that instead of getting out of breath walking through the Alps. She took my card and assured me he would call me back, which he never did.
Often the way with investigative reporting, I imagine.
Absolutely. I'm used to people shutting doors in my face or promising a callback that never materialises. Normally, I haven't climbed a mountain to get there, though. So Mr. Schmidbauer wouldn't talk to me directly, but he did tell a German parliamentary inquiry that Marsalek's possession of the Novichok document was discussed criss-cross through intelligence services all over the world. As I was saying to Georgia, Mr. Schmidbauer told the Bundestag that he believed that every service that had influence at this point was eager to talk to Marsalek about the access that he had through Wirecard to closely monitor certain money laundering operations and organised crime. He revealed to German MPs that Marsalek boasted to him during their meetings that he had security authorities across the world in his pocket and that he claimed that he had been talking to them for years. Mr. Schmidbauer said he believed that every intelligence service that respected itself had to have Marsalek on their radar and that they would have been stupid if they had not used the services that he could have offered. So this comes back to Fabio De Massi's suspicion that law enforcement agencies could have been turning a blind eye on Marsalek and Wirecard more generally because of what they had to offer. I found another troubling story from around the same time. It involved Russia's Wagner Group, which is a paramilitary unit that's been associated with conflict zones across the globe. It's involved in security in Africa, in fighting in Syria and Ukraine. Everywhere they've been, there have been reports of systematic war crimes, torture, murder, rapes. And who seems to have been in contact with them? You guessed it, Marsalek. That's yet another example of where Marsalek's political contacts cross over with the undercover world. Kilian Kleinschmidt is a UN humanitarian turned consultant. He's worked on developing aid and reconstruction projects. When I speak to him, he tells me about an aborted contract with Marsalek. Looking back, it's dotted with Russian fingerprints.
So there a lot sort of indicated a very strong Russian connection. Also to say that in his first meeting, and probably there I should have been much more cautious.
In 2017, Kilian is working with the Austrian Chancellor, Christian Kern, on projects studying migration in Africa. And so one day, Kilian sits down for a business lunch in Käfer, a Michelin-starred restaurant in central Munich. The soft glow of candlelight flickers off rustic wooden beams, and the scent of freshly baked bread and sizzling Bavarian delicacies drifts through the air. Each of the 16 private dining rooms has its own character. Some are lined with antique furniture and deep plush armchairs. Others showcase vintage wine racks and elegant chandeliers that cast golden light across crisp white tablecloths. Across the table from Kilian is Jan Marsalek. During that first lunch, Kilian is asked to conduct a study on reconstruction projects for Libya, a country that has descended into chaos and war since the fall of its dictator, Gaddafi, in 2011. How can they help the economy and make the country a destination for foreign workers? The project was due to be funded by Marsalek with the promise of a €20,000 cash injection from the Austrian government.
Yes, I agreed. It sounded good. Have the private sector, somebody from the private sector investing, in fact, in a development and stabilization strategy project in a country such as Libya.
Kilian and his team start working on a plan.
It went all through the Austrian consulting firm, including high government official from the Ministry of Defense, who was sort of working with them, which was a kind of a strange constellation.
I've seen a signed promise of payment from a brigadier in the Ministry of Defence. The invoices to Marsalek were supposed to be made out to the Russian-Libyan Cultural Institute in Moscow, an organisation that actually, it seems, doesn't exist. But things go awry. Marsalek doesn't pay. Kilian and Marsalek end up meeting again several months later. In February 2018, they have their second meeting at Marsalek's villa in Munich.
That meeting then concluded terminated our collaboration, because that's where it became clear that we had diverging views.
In what way did that become clear to you during the meeting?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of other stories around that which made us very nervous, which involved indicators that there was too much connection to Russia.
It soon became clear that this wasn't about aid for a struggling nation, or even just about making money by rebuilding an economy.
And then he started insisting on border control.
Libya is one of the countries that a lot of refugees and migrants either come from or travel through in order to get to Europe.
He had already mentioned in his first meeting with me in the Munich restaurant Der Käfer, saying, yeah, border control is important if you talk about migration. So he insisted on demobilizing militia men and shifting them into a border guard and equipping and training them.
Wow.
And I said, well, that may be part of any, let's say, demobilization and stabilization program, fine, but we are not experts in that.
Mm-hmm. So militias isn't what you deal in, really. You're more the humanitarian side of things.
No, but it has to be. But I didn't simply have the expertise on what we call a demobilization program. Mm-hmm. For militia. It didn't have the expertise. It would have been a totally different work. But he insisted on converting basically 15,000, maybe 20,000 militiamen into border guards and equipping and training them. It's a major project. And for that, you need to have an expertise which we at that point didn't have. It would have been about developing a new project. You combine that normally with other measures such as economic development, social development, and so on. But that was not of his interest somehow.
He had made some comments that made Killian pretty uncomfortable.
He also mentioned that he had been to Palmyra in Syria, facilitated again by the boys, and it was so nice. And just after the recapture of Palmyra from ISIS, and as far as we know, Palmyra was recaptured by Wagner, by the Wagner mercenaries. And so somehow he was in contact with them. And I should have reacted to this. So I'm quite angry with myself that I was too excited about the Libya project instead of, saying, who is this guy? I mean, why is he in Russia? Why is he flying to Syria with Wagner?
Then Marsalek brings another startling anecdote.
So there was sort of an unease already. Then before the meeting, Jan Marsalek, together with his two Austrians who attended that meeting, made remarks which were quite scary. He talked about equipment, and we had to discuss with them about this equipment, including body cams, and he was boasting about video material which would be great to show, but you can't show it because the boys are killing all the prisoners.
Right.
And he was laughing. So that was sort of the setting. So we felt very uncomfortable.
And do you think when he was talking about the boys and the video camera, do you think that now that he was referring to the Wagner Group in those conversations?
Well, to one of those paramilitary mercenary outfits, for sure.
When Killian finished with his tale, I was gobsmacked. It's a businessman who appears to be joking about watching people commit war crimes. Who laughs at watching people getting shot? My investigation links Marsalek to some violent Russian crimes. A Novichok assassination attempt in the UK. A mercenary group in Africa. He even apparently confessed to having witnessed war crimes. In hindsight, he seems to have tried to etch a plan to control migration with the government of Austria, one of the UK's allies. I looked into this trip to Palmyra in Syria that Marsalek mentioned to Killian. It happened in 2017. The Austrian police also investigated it, and I managed to get my hands on some of their files. They show that the trip was organised by a man linked to Russian intelligence, and that once on the ground in Syria, they were shown around by the head of intelligence for the Wagner Group. I've since discovered that the trip was organised at Marsalek's suggestion. They arranged for him to fire a rocket-propelled grenade. He went dressed in full combat gear, and he made no secret of this trip. He bragged to his friends about firing weapons and showed them pictures of himself in the war zone. And at Wirecard, where, remember, he thought he was untouchable, his links to Russia were an open secret. In a chat with one colleague, he had joked about how his Russians would shoot journalists who were asking questions, or said that if people had issues with the accounts he was running, then they should go and talk directly to Vladimir Putin.
His outspokenness is very interesting. To some degrees, he's like hiding in plain sight.
Historian Thomas Riegler again.
Because nobody would expect from a spy that he talks openly about it. Yeah. So it could have been a kind of maneuver to shake off any suspicions. Because who would suspect somebody as a spy if he talks so much about being in the company of Russian figures and anything? Yeah. So it could have been a deliberate way, actually, of muddying the water here.
There was another anecdote that stayed with Martin, Marsalek's colleague at Wirecard. It was a joke that Marsalek had made at the Christmas party that may actually have pointed to what was really going on behind the scenes of the company.
Martin, if you steal 100,000, hundreds of thousands from Wirecard, I would have no respect for you. If you're going to steal money, it has to be hundreds of millions. And of course, he said that as a joke, but it certainly rang out as very dark humor in regards to what literally probably happened with the Indian deals and similar, that he embezzled hundreds of millions out of the company.
So how did Jan Marsalek get recruited by Russia? And how did he avoid detection for years while building up a spy network across Europe? That takes us on a yacht on the French Riviera. I'm going to try and call Marsalek's Russian handler. Hello, is that Stanislav Petlinsky? That's in episode 2 of The Daily Tea Investigates, the tech boss who was Russia's secret spy.